was an early bird, and she wrote this. Let me come over here for a minute. The first thing she said is ethically writing means not purposefully misleading people or giving wrong information. And then she further said, there's a difference between having wrong information and purposely giving wrong information. So if you have an error in your writing and you didn't intentionally put it there, then that is being ethical with being fallible, right? And many of us can be fallible. So I do agree with this. But if you intentionally tell falsehoods, then that's not being ethical. However, later in this presentation, I believe I'm going to cover the what do you do when you have a living relative who doesn't really want you to put forth something about them. Sometimes you have to make a decision that falls into perhaps this category of omitting truth, and yet it's still ethical. So Stacy, make sure we come back to that question. If you will write in a comment, come back to that, the intentionally omitting, and then I can star that or remind myself to come back to it. Other thoughts, if you guys have, what does writing ethically mean to you? Let's go ahead and add your thoughts. There are no right or wrong answers, which is why I like that this is a discussion format. Another thing that Stacy had shared was mentioning living minors with caution. Adults, I'm a little more fair game, but minors need us to advocate on their behalf. That is a very, very good point, and we will come and talk about the livings later on. So how about this one? Not divulging family secrets that may hurt living people or their immediate family members. How many generations this encompasses can be a moving target. Jill, that is a great point, and we're going to come back to that a little bit later. So I'm going to go ahead and star that. I'm going to star Stacy's comments about the adults and minors and living, because we will be talking about that a little bit later in this presentation. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and start. I got to turn off a lot of these different banners. All right. Now we are ready. Okay. Now, why ask why? Just put in a comment that we'll definitely be talking about this as well. Purposely changing facts makes your story family history fiction. So we are going to be coming to these topics throughout the presentation. Over the past decades, I've seen frequent discussions about the trouble with ethics in genealogy. Well, last month we had a webinar that was focused on how to handle copyright and fair use. And that topic does fall into the ethical standards to a degree. There's other aspects of writing that halt people trying to tell family stories. So if you haven't watched that webinar, remember it's on the playlist on the Write Your Family History channel. And you can go back and watch that and get the handout and leave comments. I respond to all new comments on our channel. So don't feel like I didn't watch that, I can't comment. You can absolutely comment on that. Oops. Oh, I'm going to change something real quick. If you give me a moment. One of the things I tried to do is preload the presentation into my platform. But unfortunately, what I just saw by clicking at advance is it takes out all of the animation. And I kind of like animation. So I need to go here and reshare my screen. So I do apologize. I thought it was going to work, and it did work for a minute, and then it decided not to work anymore. All right. Okay, here we go. That looks good. And Cynthia, you just dropped a question, and I'm going to, or a comment, and I will come back to that later. So I do appreciate you taking that time to add that comments. Okay. So let's talk about ethics. Hopefully we'll have time for discussion at the end of any issues that you're facing and you don't know how to handle. Remember, use the comment section if we can't tackle it live. So let's start with talking about ethics and what they are not. Ethics actually do not have a sole definition. And let me explain it by pulling up something on this screen here. feelings. If you solely say ethics are based what I feel is right or wrong, that's not what ethics are. Because some people feel squeamish about doing what's right, and other people have no problem doing things that are unethical. So our emotions aren't always reliable. So our emotions can play into our ethical decisions, but we can't just say what we feel is right or wrong is ethical. The next one is whatever society accepts. And I'm going to put a question on the screen here. What are some examples of unethical societal standards that have happened in the past or now that you're aware of? While you're doing that, we'll keep going with the presentation, and I'll pull in your comments here in a moment. But let me move this here. Okay. Lots of things going on at one time. All right. So if you say, well, ethics are whatever society deems acceptable, society may accept things as ethical that are unethical and vice versa. And the other problem of saying, oh, ethics are just what society accepts is that it's constantly changing. So I wouldn't solely define ethics as what society accepts. Additionally, I wouldn't say ethics apply to only the realm of religious beliefs. Their ethics apply to atheists and devoutly religious people, regardless of their foundational worldview. So we cannot constrain ethics to just worldview. And finally, you can't just say ethics are what the law dictates, because laws can deviate from what is ethical. I'm thinking of slavery and Jim Crow laws as examples of unethical laws, which discount the definition of ethics only being what is legal. Okay, so here is a societal one that Cynthia thought of is children out of wedlock. In the past, that was considered unethical or taboo even. And now it is not necessarily that big of a deal. So that's a societal standard of what is ethical, what is right, what is wrong. That seems to have changed. Good point, Cynthia. Thanks so much. If you guys think of any others, we'll pull them in later. So let's think about some more practical definitions of what ethicals are, or maybe some authoritative examples, or just examples of definitions that others have put forth. According to the Markula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University, ethics are standards of right and wrong that prescribe what humans ought to do, usually in terms of rights, obligations, benefits to societies, fairness, or specific values. Stacy brought in a great comment. I love when you guys are live and you can share your comments as we go. It depends when it comes to society, because there's black and there's white, but there's also gray. And yes, we wish we could have our emoji from the other channel, the it depends icon. Very good. Okay, so some standards are defined by organizational groups or communal groups. One such group are standards defined by the Association of Professional Genealogists, and they suggest what genealogists ought to do in terms of rights, obligations, benefits to genealogical clients, the research, fairness, and specific genealogical values. Now, some of these oughts, these ethical oughts, are present research results and opinions in a clear, well-organized manner. Now you may think, oh, well, that just seems like good practice of genealogy research. I wouldn't necessarily put it under ethics, but that's something to think about when it comes to this concept of ethics as it applies to family histories. Sometimes it's just best practices, and you may overlook this. Oh, that's a good practice, and that would make something ethical writing, when you may have overlooked that concept of well organized and easy to read, that's ethical. In some cases, yeah, for sure. Another one, it's refraining from withholding, suppressing, or knowingly misquoting or misinterpreting sources or data. And another one they put forth is report appropriately qualified genealogical conclusions based on the weight of the evidence with fully and accurate citations. So now being ethical is citing our sources, using quality sources, and basing our conclusions on that. And to me, again, it starts to sound like just standard genealogy practices of quality research. So I hope that expands your mind a little, that you don't not thinking of extreme right and wrong in the moral area, but just in what makes a good writer, a quality research production that you put forth. If you have any comments on that, go ahead and share those with me. I'd love to hear your thoughts. So, ethics. Is there a way to kind of simplify the definition of ethics down a little bit? Actions that an individual believes to be right or wrong. Now, the problem becomes in ethics is you and I can disagree on what is right and what is wrong. So, since we're in this world of family history writers and genealogy in general, we're going to try to push ourselves in a direction that we can have some common ground on what we feel is right or wrong in the research and the writing we do. Okay. So, one of the things as I started researching this topic and trying to put it together for writers is I discovered that ethics can vary depending on your background. So, your training outside of genealogy research will directly impact how you tell a story. Let me give you an example. How many of you are lawyers or know lawyers, married to lawyers, have lawyers in the family? Many lawyers will be very cautious about legal liabilities when they tell stories. So they get super serious about copyright, but then super serious about potential libel, slander, defamation, and so on and so forth. Privacy is another thing that they are very, very cautious with. No, I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I'm just saying their worldview when it comes to ethics is one of being cautious with the propensity or the possibility of a litigation coming forth when they write. They will also search for evidence that can uphold in the court of family opinion or the court of fellow genealogy researchers. So they are super, super strict when it comes to their evidence that they seek out. Now, someone with a creative writing background or literary scholarship, they're going to have a different approach. How many of you have that kind of background, creative writing or an English major, maybe even a French major? You will tend to be more liberal with your use of literary techniques to tell a story, because with your creative writing background, the good story is very important. Not only that, you are more comfortable in inventing dialogue. And so when it comes to, is it ethical to invent dialogue? You're going to lean towards, yeah, sure, if it tells a good story, where someone who has a lawyer background might be could I get in trouble here? Let me know if you agree or disagree, or tell me some other backgrounds that you may come into contact with that would guide or influence how they approach ethics. One more, this is the one I'm most familiar with, and that is someone with a journalism background. Now, you can love journalists or hate journalists, but being a trained journalist, I know that we focus on sharing facts. Right? We do want to go and get the facts. If you've heard just the facts, man, that's an investigator, but that's also what we were taught in journalism school. Go get the facts. And yes, there is some other aspects that come into it. And that is, we tend, or we used to tend, or used to strive to write without bias so readers can make their own decisions about a story. Lately, I've seen some polarizations of people putting forth their own worldview. And you know what? I'm not too upset about that. But I prefer reading journalists who I can't tell what their bias is because they're more classically trained as a journalist to hide their opinions. Now, journalists often tend to be less concerned with privacy matters and more concerned about telling a story. And journalists often come from if it bleeds, it leads, because I got to sell stories. So notice how the ethics are going to depend based on your background. And that is a discussion worth having and considering when you come into writing family histories. Okay, some other differences. Lawyers will often write more technical stories. It's just their nature. They're constantly writing legal briefs so that when they come to tell a story, it's going to be very technical. Creative writers can tell more verbose stories. They just love to fill in details. But journalists often share brief stories in an easy to digest way. Now, one of the reasons why journalists are more brief is because you only have a certain number of column inches. So you have to get the most important details out fast. Now, can each of these fields have overlap? Can you be brief technical? Sure. Can you be verbose and technical? Sure. But verbose and brief, I don't know that you can really do that. If there is somebody who knows how to be verbose and brief at the same time, you got to let me know. I want to hear about it. And Paul P. Smith, I'm glad you dropped a question. You followed the right format, dropping a Q in front of your question. We'll save that for a little bit later, but I do want to highlight that's how you drop your questions into the live session with us. All right. Now, creative writers and journalists realize that a good story will share more than just good news. They know that tension and conflict and struggles make for enjoyable reading. So a lot of times our backgrounds can overlap. But my question today is, how does a family historian balance the different approaches to telling a story and doing it ethically? Well, the first thing we have to realize is that we're dealing with relationships. We're dealing with our families and the relationships, hopefully, we want to have with them. And hopefully, the relationships we want future generations to have with them. And we need to balance authenticity. That's a hard word to say. Authenticity and accuracy with compassion. And that's where this ethical line will need to be judged. So there are a couple of comments that came in. Verbose plus brief equals descriptive words. I like that. That's kind of good. There's an ethical issue. Modern times have modern ethical issues that we have to deal with. And what are we going to do when we write stories about individuals with certain worldviews, certain practices, whether you agree or you disagree with those topics? These are things we're all going to have to consider in the future. Okay. So I wanted to talk more about this real quick. About this topic of dealing with relationships, right? If a journalist writes a story that's unflattering about someone, as long as it's not libel, slander, or defamation, the impact of their story isn't felt by the writer of that story daily. But if you write about your sister, your mother, your uncle, or your cousin, you'll deal with consequences more intimately. So we have to try to find a balance. Now, Attaching newspaper articles, criminal court cases, and other documentation to an ancestor's profile on a public tree such as Ancestry or the World Family Trees such as Family Search, Wiki, all of those are ethical questions to consider. And so you have to start asking yourself a couple of questions. Let me pause for just a second. How many of you have allergies right now? Spring is starting to transition here. And so my allergies are acting up. It's really frustrating. All right. So the questions you need to start considering are you documenting your ancestors or exposing them to judgment and harm? And are you exposing their descendants to harassment or mental anguish? These are things to consider. And we're also going to go through one person's standard. And I'm going to tell you that there's no easy answer here. That you have to consciously make choices here, because sometimes you have to write a story that may invite judgment or harm in some way, may trigger some anguish. But if those stories don't get told, there is healing that's going to be ignored. So let's dive into this standard that I came across while I was researching this topic and making some decisions on some stories that I needed to put forth in my own family history writing, both my personal story, my memoir, as well as a family history that has multiple other people in it. So one researcher put forth this question and their standard. They always ask, would any of the information I have cause embarrassment, pain, or discomfort to the person's family if it were disclosed? If so, they recommend avoiding including those stories in their genealogy research. So not linking it to the family tree or writing the family history. But the question is this a good standard to follow? Well, if we use this adage, will we even be able to write stories, especially sensitive topics or dark stories? Because all of our ancestors weren't always great people, should we say? That's passing judgment, right? They did some things that weren't pleasant. So what will our stories look like? So let me take apart these aspects of something that causes embarrassment, pain, or discomfort. Let's go through it. If we avoid any stories that cause embarrassment or are embarrassing, then there's a story about Deborah Sue Maffitt that would never get told. Now, Deborah Sue Maffitt grew up in Cut and Shoot, Texas, which is just north of Houston. And yes, it's a real place. She gained weight when she worked in a bakery, and people began calling her Thunder Thighs. When she told this story to reporters during a pageant, the headline after she won said, "Thunder Thighs wins Miss Clayland." Is this an embarrassing story? Would it cause her embarrassment if somebody revealed it? Well, it kind of depends on the nature of that individual, right? But she was extremely embarrassed by that article. But she went on to win Miss America and inspired many others to follow their dreams no matter the obstacles, including myself. So, refraining from embarrassment is a terrible standard when writing family history. So, can you be cautious? Sure. But some embarrassing stories help you know of what people had to overcome in order to achieve certain success. What about avoiding details that may cause pain? Would you agree that growing up with an alcoholic or abusive parent is painful? Yeah, I would. And yet, Halle Berry, Charlize Theron, and Brooke Shields had those parents. Should we exclude the stories of their alcoholic parents from their stories just because it has painful memories? If pain is a standard, we would never talk about death, illness, job losses, injuries, neglect, or anything that makes our stories accurate. Because these stories also are push and pull factors for the decisions our ancestors made. So let's give it another example of a painful story for some. The topic of adoption is painful for many, for the adoptee or the person placing a child up for adoption. One person's pain may be another person's joy, but the story belongs to both person and even the extended family members. A sister who has an adopted brother, a grandma who has an adopted child. The story belongs to integral persons and also extended family members. For instance, Auntie has a cousin who was adopted. Now, we on the back shelf, we have the compilation of the descendants of his grandparents. So it would include both Andy and his cousin. Now, that cousin may not want to be in the Lee family history book talking about being adopted. He has that choice. However, he cannot force his adopted mother to exclude him from her story in any book because that's part of her story. And the same would go through for his siblings through adoption. They can mention their brother. They may be more cautious about the details, but him being adopted is part of their story. Okay, here is a sensitive topic that a viewer just brought in. Ancestors' health information in a book, but offer a suggestion reason so that family may pay attention to their own health. So true. This goes back to alcoholism. I was able to heal from the grief and the pain and the anger of having an alcoholic father who was the son of an alcoholic father, who was the son of an alcoholic father for several generations. And so including these painful, potentially even embarrassing stories can help healing. And here could also have health consequences for future generations. Great point. Thank you so much. Why ask why, buddy? Budry. I never know how to say that last part of your name. So let's go to another topic, and that is divorce. Perhaps you have a female ancestor or relative who's uncomfortable because she was divorced multiple times. And yet, one man fathered her children and created relationship links. Another man is the only uncle her nieces and nephew ever knew. And the last man that she married was the one that showed up at family reunions when the nieces and nephews were older. So if discomfort is the standard, no one will ever share memories of family reunions and their relationship with other people, and that becomes problematic. So as you can see, this topic, this question of ethics and that its implied standard would likely prevent most genealogists from writing family histories that are worth reading. So there will be significant gaps in the stories of our ancestors. So I'm not a fan of avoiding embarrassment. We can be careful when we talk about embarrassing stories. We can be careful when we talk about stories that could be painful, and we can be careful about stories that are uncomfortable truth. But it would be actually unethical, in my opinion, to exclude them completely, because then we're not really telling the family story. And then Stacy says she has 4 straight generations of divorce. What does that do to each generation in terms of their concepts of marriage or trying to get along with the exes getting along, or children being pitted between 2 families? And if it's for multiple generation, how do you break that cycle, or is there a cycle worth breaking? So notice that we do actually have to include some of these stories in what we present. And as I've said before, I'm not a really good fan of this proposed ethical standard when it comes to writing genealogies. So what is a more achievable goal for family historians who want to be respectful and ethical in their writing? Our goal should be to be accurate. And there are some things we can do while we're being accurate to also be sensitive. So let me share with you some of the standards that I would recommend. These are achievable ethical standards. So the first is to be accurate. I already said that, but it's worth repeating. Accuracy, accuracy, accuracy. Next, try to be neutrally objective. I'll explain these more further in a moment. Be thorough. And then protect the living. So, when it comes to accuracy, there's two types of truth. There's a lot of debate about what truth is these days, but there's two major types of truth. The first is factual truth, and the second is subjective truth. Another way would be to say it's objective truth and subjective truth. So let's go through that a little bit more. Okay. First, in order to be accurate and ethical, we need to consult documents. If a family rumor says someone was an alcoholic or had mental health problems, don't state the gossip as fact. We can do something with the rumor, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But we need to have documentation for criminal activity, divorce, suicide, or other sensitive topics, which is why we need to cite our sources. And we need to validate our stories with details. And these details will likely come from photos, letters, journals, diaries, government records, church records, and court cases, to name a few. Additionally, if we have facsimiles of documentation, so we have a photo, but it's really a photo of a document, or we have photos of other objects, we need to use the proper credit for those photos as we're including it into our stories. Dealing with factual truth is what genealogists deal with every day as we establish relationships, life events, and other biographical details. So this part of being ethical should come as no surprise, and it should be something we're always and already trying to achieve. However, the tricky area for genealogists is when we deal with subjective truth. And it comes from those memories, feelings, opinions, perceptions, and core beliefs. Many of those may show up in those diaries, those journals, and the scrapbooks, and the newspaper articles, and so forth. So, how can a family history writer include subjective truth in their personal memoirs or family histories? We need to do it carefully. Here are my suggestions. In personal history, it must be presented as your thoughts rather than verifiable facts. So you may say, I remember it happening this way. Or perhaps I was mistaken, but I believe. If you have other suggestions, feel free to drop those in of ways that we can signal to other readers that this is my subjective truth. You are entitled to your feelings. You're entitled to your perceptions, especially if you're writing your own personal family history. You're entitled to all of those because they do impact the choices you make and how you interact with the world. We just want you, especially when you're talking about somebody else or talking about a memory of somebody else, to signal to other readers that it's just what you believe. This is your subjective truth. And it leaves the story open to it another side or another view. Here is one that I like. What I was told, what has been told. Now that goes to the next topic, which is when you're dealing with family histories, but it could also be in your personal history. So in a personal history, I was told growing up, women didn't work outside of the home until the 1940s. And so I wanted to be, the champion of women's rights. Well, then as a genealogist, I realized women worked outside of the home before 1940. So that actually needed some clarifying statements in order to understand, right? But it's still in my personal history. Now, if I'm going to go and I'm going to talk about an ancestor, I would say something like Caroline remembers, or um, according to Grandma Pearl's diary, or I was told and I have been told. Okay. Now, if you're liking this video so far and you're watching the replay, go ahead and hit the like button and leave a comment. It really helps these webinars reach more people and helps me know that I should keep doing these videos. Now, what about blending factual and subjective truth together? Accurate documentary practices help us do this, right? But we should try to be writing in that clear and organized way. And oh, by the way, that's what the Association of Professional Genealogists already suggested. We want to use the accurate sources, right? We want to try to have quality sources, and we want to avoid misquoting or misinterpreting the evidence that we see. So you do that, and you'll be able to include your factual and subjective, or your objective and subjective truth in your family stories, and achieve our desire of being ethical through being accurate in what we write. Let me know if that makes sense. By dropping it in a chat. Yeah, that makes sense. Or, hey, wait, I have a question. And we can go from there. I want to look at a couple of the comments before we go on to the next topic. Okay, so let me go ahead and tackle this because we have just recently talked about it. Is one ethical topic I have been asked about. My relative is ashamed of her bad marriage, which resulted in a divorce, does not want this information in the family tree, assuming also write-ups. Okay, we're going to be talking about publishing and writing and building a family tree a little bit later, but I want to go ahead and make sure I hit it now just in case what I think we're going to talk about later doesn't actually come clear, and I want to put it right now. There is a difference between publicly sharing information and privately sharing information. I'm an advocate that you should put all facts in your family tree. Now, she's living. This person is living. Because you keep saying her. In that case, it should be privatized anyway. After her death, this is her truth. This is the truth about her, that she had, as she says, a bad marriage. One of the things I would recommend you doing, if you can, is try to work to get a statement of why was it a bad marriage, so that it could be a cautionary tale for her descendants or for her nieces and nephews going forward. Try to get her interpretation of things so that she can put forth her thoughts about the situation, even if she feels ashamed. And then we'll talk later about how would you actually go about presenting it. But I would try to record it now, just so you have it, because it is truth. And at a later date, it needs to be available to others, but we can be respectful of a timeline of their choosing. Okay. Okay. And Cynthia says, sometimes when I write about a deceased ancestor, I forget that the living might be affected. And I'll have some suggestions about that a little bit later. All right. So I don't see any questions. So let's move on to the next topic. And that is being neutrally objective. Now, this does come from my newspaper journalist background when I was taught at Texas A&M University. Great professors. And they say, as you write, do not take any sides. Even in the most egregious level of brutality, leave your judgment of actions out of the stories you write. First, don't write a hit piece. So, what's an example of a hit piece? I don't know how many of you have even heard of this book or let alone read this book, but The Spare by Prince Harry is a hit piece against his family. Now, I'm not saying it's not accurate. I'm saying the tone is intended to harm his family members. And in my opinion, it looks petty and weak, regardless of how factual it may or may not be. So it's not a great example for ethical family historians to follow. It's an example of what not to do. Okay. So if we're going to be neutrally objective, and we can still tell our stories, we can still say my family stinks, but we can do it in a more neutrally objective way. What we're going to do is we're going to cite provable facts, particularly if we're writing about ancestors we've never met. Next, we're going to clearly identify our opinions. That ties back to that subjective truth, which can be concluded but must be presented as an opinion or verified detail. So Prince Harry can say, my brother William was a jerk for not befriending me when we went to boarding school. I thought that was a jerk move. Now, how many of you have siblings who you went to school with, and there were times like, I don't want you to be around me. You stay over there. It may still be jerky, but it also is kind of natural. And we also don't know William's side of the things. So you can say, hey, that was a jerk move, or I feel that was a jerk move. I feel hurt. I feel betrayed. I have a need for relationship. It also sounds like nonviolent communication, which is a great book that I recommend. You can include it. You just have to have a tone where you clearly say, I think he was a jerk. I think that move was jerky. And then when you apply it to your ancestors, you can do the same thing. If you have any questions or comments about that, go ahead and put that in the chat there. Now, the other thing you want to do is you want to hide your biases, right? So that nobody knows whose side you're on or your opinion about an ancestor and their actions. Also strive to write so that you don't necessarily are presenting a worldview. I will admit this is it's easier said than done. There are times when you have an American worldview and you're writing about a Canadian or a British ancestor and you don't really realize, oh, I've got some biases here. And one of the ways to overcome that is to share your stories with others, particularly from a different background. If you're writing about a British ancestor and you're not really British, you can ask a British friend of yours or a colleague to say, hey, can you read this and see if I have an American bias in this story that I'm writing about my ancestor? Adding details, clarification, like we talked about the bobsled in a previous video. I said, hey, how do you define a bobsled in Canada for somebody who's America? That helps you overcome your bias because you're trying to cross the language barrier. But trying to be unbiased, really, it's best to share your stories with others and get opinions backed. Look at this. I don't want to hang out with my brother, but I was the only one allowed to pick on him. Got into fights because of that. See, again, there is some natural human relationship that shows up in our stories, and we want to allow for these other sibling to have another view of the story. So we just always want to try to add things to our stories that let people know this is what I thought. And just be more clear about it. Because on one hand, you'd say, well, it's my memoir. Of course, these are my thoughts. You just add a little more clarity. But you have to be very, very careful when you talk about an ancestor and say, oh, that ancestor was insert negative description of them. For instance, that ancestor was racist. Well, how do you know? He said something that we think is really racist. We're going to talk about presentism a little bit later. But what you really should say, these comments would seem racist to a modern audience. And that's how you can be unbiased, because you're not saying that you agree that it's racist. You're just saying that, yeah, some people might think this is kind of inappropriate. All right. I like that. right. The next way to write ethically is to be thorough. Strive to tell the whole story about an individual. People are rarely entirely defined by one moment or one event in their lives. Just checking the chime real quick. Their actions and events may be turning points on a timeline. So share the whole story and do not whitewash the past. Good, bad, and in between stories help you avoid doing this very thing. You don't want to cover up the ugly parts of a personal history. You want to go back to the first principle of being accurate, the second principle of being neutrally objective. It leads us to the next point of being thorough. Now, if your research includes unpleasant truths, bigamy, infidelity, unwed mothers, racism, slavery, abuse, things that the past felt was immoral or unethical, share sufficient details so that we understand the context of those relationships or those actions. And then now that it's in context, we've been thorough and now we are being ethical. Let's see. So I just want to highlight this again. Be specific about actions or words a person shares rather than passing judgment on them. Include the details that enrich your story and allow for information you were not aware of. For example, I perceived her as being true. Perhaps she was experiencing trauma that manifested itself in harsh words, but these are the words she said, and this is how I felt. That's being specific. And as you share unpleasant truths objectively and thoroughly, you allow the judgment to be in the hands of your reader. And I feel that's just the best approach we can take. Now, I'm going to take a tangent a little bit, and we're going to go into what Christians call the Old Testament, Jews call the Bible, I believe. And we're going to talk about 4 unpleasant stories very quickly. Tamar was perceived to be a harlot, yet Judah declared her more righteous than him because she was trying to get him to practice the law of levirate marriage. Now, that is something that may seem unethical or immoral today, but it was the custom of society then, and her approach, was it ethical or unethical? That is something, oh, thank you, Stacy, the Torah. That is something that they were practicing, and she was trying to force his hand there. The next story is Rahab. She worked in a lady of the night establishment, yet she helped men of God enter and leave a city. Ruth was misjudged multiple times, but she was loyal to her mother-in-law. Bathsheba was involved in adultery, but she became part of the lineage of Joseph, the husband of Jesus's mother. So by sharing these stories, what am I getting at? These women have a lineage for Christians led to the Messiah, or at least caring for the Messiah. And what is the major takeaway? Why would I bring it up? These are unpleasant stories. Well, I'd like for you to share what you learned in the comments, and we're going to continue that discussion later. I do hope you see the importance of sharing unpleasant truths in your family history with neutral objectivity. I'm not saying the Torah or the Christian Bible does it neutrally objectively, but when we write the stories, we can take clues from inclusions of unpleasant stories for perhaps misunderstood women and include that in our stories, and we will learn some great lessons from that. Before we discuss my final recommendations, you may wonder about ethics and how it relates to the law. Those of you with the legal concerns or legal background, this might be your question. Can you be sued for writing about a dead person? In most cases, no. There are libels against defamation, libel, and slander, but they apply to harm caused to living individuals. So, as such, you can concern yourself more with protecting the privacy of the living than with maybe your 4th great granduncle. We still want to be considerate and objective, and again, not write a hit piece. But it should give you a more sense of relief knowing that legal truth. If I am wrong, or if the law is different in other localities, please feel free to drop those in the comment. I'd appreciate it. All right. Now, Stacy mentioned protecting the living earlier in this presentation. Mentioning living minors is a caution. Adults, she's a little bit less concerned about, but she does advocate for being children. Well, let me give you some tips. She's on the right path. Do not share information about living persons without their consent. That should be your standard. Just the same as you would get consent for images or text that we talked about in the copyright class, you would get a release form or a permission form to use someone's stories. If you don't have the permission, can you print a family history about living persons? You can produce books with information about living individuals if you are the only custodian of those books. If you plan to share a book publicly and want to include potentially damaging stories, you need to limit the use of names and identifying information. So, for example, I had a negative experience with a pageant director in my memoir that's on my back shelf. The only information I included about her was that she directed the pageant and the name of the pageant. Now, a reader would have to work really hard to figure out who she was because there were not a lot of public records kept. I don't even think it made the newspapers. It would be really hard to track it down. And most readers would not bother going through the trouble. And yet, because I protected her identity, other than to say she directed thus and such pageant, I've done my best to include this negative experience I had and how that experience then affected my next decisions and my next competition. You can include it, but notice how I tried to protect her identity. So, respect the privacy of living individuals. I'll come back to that one in a minute. If you discover private and unpleasant details about a living relative or a recently deceased relative with living children, consider not including those discoveries in published books, regardless if it's public or private, without their consent. It's particularly needs to be considered when you're talking about misattributed parentage. There are a lot of ethical considerations, and we can have a discussion in the comment section about what to do in those aspects. That way we can keep the presentation as short as it can be, because I know I've taken a lot of your time already. Thank you for sticking around for me and with me. So let's go on to the next topic I wanted to share is the further back in time your ancestors are, the more freedom you can have when writing about them. So the more distant the event, the easier it is to share. Keep those things in mind as principles. All right. In your research, you'll likely uncover many details. Consider the different emotional weight caused by sharing the following. Okay. A non-paternity event for an uncle versus a great-granduncle. Which is easier to share? Which ones do you need to be more careful with? And somebody earlier had talked about the sliding scale of impact of a story. Well, again, an uncle who's alive today or recently deceased versus a great-granduncle, 2 generations removed, it's a little bit easier to write about that non-paternity event of a great-granduncle. How about a cousin going to jail versus a second great-grandfather who went to jail? Which is easier to talk about? To be honest, we kind of laugh about Andy's great-grandfather, the second great-grandfather who changed his name and because his dad was in jail and died during a jailbreak. So that's an easier ethical decision to make. It's like, yeah, go ahead and include it and we can go ahead and publish it. It's not that big of a deal. But if it was my cousin or my child or my niece and nephew, I need to be a little more cautious. And finally, when we come to the children born out of wedlock, a sibling having a child born out of wedlock versus a third cousin once removed who is deceased. It might be easier to tell that story, but you still have to be careful because that third cousin once removed could be alive and have their children alive, and they may not want that story out. However, as we stated earlier, children born out of wedlock in modern times isn't so taboo as it in previous generations. So there's a lot of considerations. You just have to be careful. And if you follow the principles I told you before, you will be more successful. So now that we've covered some guiding principles, I hope you start adding comments to this webinar about other ethical concerns that we can cover. I have a few more principles before we wrap it up. Okay. I hope that you won't perpetuate family myths that everybody wants to believe. Many families have legends or myths or fun fables. But as ethical genealogists, we want to get out of that habit, but we can incorporate the myths because sometimes it achieves a purpose, even inaccurate stories. So myths, according to this article, which is mentioned in the handout, if it's not, let me know and I'll add it to it. They can give structure to the past and reveal how families wants to be organized and relate to it and perhaps why. Stories may hide secrets. Few families members enjoy family feuds, disown relatives, or alcoholic-induced accidents. Thus, some legends are created to hide the truth. And myths promote specific family roles. These define who are the black sheep or the role model and so on in your family tree. So how do you include family myths, and is it ethical to do so? Well, it depends. I did discuss this topic in the video, Are You Debunking Family Myths? How to Set the Record Straight, and that is linked in your handout because I just added it this morning. Now, I demonstrated how I handled the inaccurate death story of a second great-grandfather in the family scrapbook. The story reveals how our family wants to relate how Joseph died. They're probably hiding some secret that Joseph did die of either a violent incident or an alcoholic event or just plain stupidity. And Joseph's role could be that the family wants him just to be the immigrant who died young, not someone whose bad choices led to a bad outcome. But the story of him dying outside of First Hayes, which didn't exist, yelling halt to a German, well, German, stop means halt in German too. The story, it's inaccurate. And an ethical genealogist would put it to an end. Now, him being a young immigrant who died, an immigrant who died young, leaving 3 small children behind, and him making dumb choices, all of that does make a great story. But in the book's appendix about Joseph, I debunk the family legend and I dissect each portion of those claims, like the Fort Hayes and Germans yell halt to say stop. It makes sense. And since I know the family legend is inaccurate, I want to put a stop to it so that I can present an ethical family story. So don't perpetuate falsehoods, debunk family stories, and correct incorrect relationships. Now, we should avoid being judgmental in our writing. I kind of alluded to this before because it bothers our readers and because it's unethical. And we need to be careful not to project our thoughts of the past. We should not project onto the past the thought that they should have known better and had done something more. When we do this, instead of accepting the past as it is what it was, we write family histories we wish it should have been. When we change history to be what it wanted to be by omission or commission, we distort the past. So what should we do? We should recognize people can only act on available knowledge at the time, just like we do today. And when we write about the past, that is how we achieve it. We're being accurate, neutrally objective, thorough, and we protect the living. We can write stories that avoid presentism. So I do have a video about that that's linked in the handout. Now, I love this song from the Rascal Flatts, and you can go ahead and pause this video when I get all the lyrics up. If we don't celebrate our ancestors' transformation by trying to avoid embarrassment, pain, or discomfort, we don't tell the stories of triumph, and we can't really embrace it and understand things well. Now, finally, I want to talk about the last tip that ethical genealogists are aware of. And this should answer a number of the comments and questions people left earlier today. Family history writers should strive to tell factual and accurate stories about our ancestors, but we should make these stories available for others at the right time, in the right way, to ensure we're being ethical in our efforts. Now, where can these be placed? In our personal library. So this goes back to the comment of the sister or the relative that went through the nasty divorce and didn't want to have that included. In your personal library, you can have that story. Now, you may be cautious about who you in your family you allow to have access to that story, and you'll probably not share that publicly because this relative doesn't want you to share it publicly. But in time, your story will eventually expand beyond the family, your personal library, to family access so that other relatives can understand her story and the impact it has on future generations. So keep that in mind. Okay. Now, in this story, there are 5 ways you can go about sharing sensitive family stories. Some of them are more ethical than others. Let's go through them right now. The first one is the advance review. And this is when you share your stories with those connected before publication. So you take your copy and you say, hey, relative with the bad marriage, here's what I want to say about you. What do you think? Now, you can consider their feedback, which could be the removal of the sensitive story. 3 books. For the previous one here, not necessarily 3 books, 3 places you can place a book. You can place a book in the library. You can place the book for the family to consume, and you can place that same book with public access. I think this is your question, and I'm hoping I'm clarifying this. However, I have said in a previous story, you can have 2 versions of the same story, which goes back to this topic right here about the advance review. Sometimes your relatives want to forbid inclusion of a specific story. It is up to you to decide, am I going to write one version for everybody? Or am I going to provide and then keep one for me that includes the part of the story that is accurate, even though some people don't want it in their story? And that's something to consider. But when you give an advance copy, this is the way you can actually seek the permission to talk about the living and get their feedback and also maybe get their side of the story. So there is an ethical approach in that way if you're dealing with sensitive subjects, but just be careful because some people want to take over how a story is written. But your job, if you follow those principles I talked about before, avoiding presentism, you're being thorough, you're being accurate, you're being neutral, then you can disregard their feedback, but again, decide we're dealing with relatives. What relationship do you want to have with those individuals? The next method is write whatever you want, regardless of the consequences. This is the most unethical path for family historians to take, I believe. If you're doing that hit piece, like Prince Harry did, the consequences are going to be felt for generations to come. That's going to be a bridge that's really, really hard to repair, in my opinion. Sometimes you may just want to tell a story and it's not as egregious as a hit piece. It's just a minor inclusion of the story and you don't care about the consequences. That's fine too. It's a little smaller bridge burning, but you have to decide, is it worth burning that bridge? Um, I'm not actually a fan of that approach, but it is an approach you can consider. The next thing you could possibly do is you can fictionalize the story. Now, somebody made earlier a comment, purposely changing facts makes your story historical fiction. And that goes back to my concept of don't whitewash the past, right? Um, for fiction writers, go for it. But writing a family history, your family doesn't realize what about them, and then they get confused what's truth and what's not true. So since we're focused more on fact rather than fiction, I would caution against this approach. But if you choose it, I won't say it's unethical. Another thing you could do is you could publish your stories anonymously. While your family may speculate about whether you wrote the story, you can share truthful stories without attaching your name to the research, particularly if there are some less than moral or less than stellar stories to be written about. I'm trying to find the right word to put for those black sheep type of stories. But be mindful that you might be revealed if you share stories only you would have known. And so that an anonymous publishing might not play out. Now, here's one that is ethical, and it might be the solution to many questions you may have about writing ethically. After people in this story have passed away, you can share their stories, but be mindful of whether you're sharing the story publicly or just within the family. The purpose of this approach is to save family relationships while still recording truthful stories for future generations. Now, when it comes to writing about somebody who's deceased, who has living children, or people that knew them living, that are still alive, it can be sensitive. Sometimes you might need to wait for them to pass away, or sometimes you need to say, "Hey, daughter Stacy, let's pretend that I had a daughter named Stacy, and I said, "Hey, I want this story published after I pass away because by that time all the people will have been deceased, and so now everybody in the family can share the story." But recognize I'm not saying published for the whole wide world to read, but published for the family to read, and then placing a couple copies in a library so relatives can find it in the future. Now, again, ethics are about it depends. There are no hard and fast rules that are universal standards for ethics when writing family histories. I hope you've kind of seen that as I've been kind of hesitant to declare this is what you should do, but rather give you guidelines of, hey, if I feel I'm meeting these standards, I'm comfortable with this choice that I've made, then I have been accurate. And remember, the standards that you have to be comfortable is, am I accurate? Have I been thorough? Have I been neutrally objective? Have I avoided presentism? Have I debunked falsehoods? And am I publishing with care so that I preserve relationships while still telling that accurate family story? If you do that, I feel you will be an ethical writer with your family histories that you produce. I'm going to cover a couple comments, and then I actually have to slip out because my daughter is at the school waiting for me to pick her up. Not divulging family secrets may hurt living or their immediate family members. How many generations this encompasses can be a moving target, and that is very true. However, many of those secrets, I need to stop the timer. Many of those secrets are just because those individuals were uncomfortable with the reality that they faced, or hiding those secrets was to preserve a certain family narrative. But if it's a false narrative, is it doing more harm than good to the overall family members? One thing that I would suggest, and it may seem kind of childish, but the Book of Life, Moana, and Coco are 3 movies. They're animated movies that talk about family secrets, various family secrets, and the impact it had on the main character. And if you watch those, you will see, maybe that secret actually needed to be shared, because not sharing those secrets actually is harming the present generation. So when it comes to ethics, it's your choice of what's right or wrong. What are you comfortable sharing, and what format are you comfortable presenting these books in? And then you'll be able to better manage that sliding scale or that moving target. When should the document truth be ignored? When should it be ignored? Okay, here's a when. You can tell the truth about a violent action without getting to every gory detail. And in that case, that's when I would ignore some truths in order to tell a story without harming your reader. Does that make sense? So some of your readers are very, very sensitive to extreme violence and that kind of thing and gore. But you can say, for instance, my aunt has some stories that she could tell me about how violent and abusive my father was before he stopped drinking alcohol. And I know enough that it's sufficient. I don't need any more to add, because what would it really add? I've had sufficient information that my dad was a very different man before he stopped drinking alcohol. And in that case, that would be my recommendation of what to ignore. But if my dad killed somebody, he didn't, but if he did, I wouldn't ignore that fact. Like, in a drunken rage, he killed this person. That is not a fact you should ignore, because that can also explain his violent tempers. Maybe he dislikes when people fight and it gets him really antsy. Well, it goes back to that situation, right? He saw what it was like to get extreme with violence. So when I'm ignoring stories, it's typically because I don't need to give every detail on a topic. Instead, give enough that people get the general idea and then move on from there. Okay, Jill, you wrote this comment right here in the comment section, because I'm running out of time in this webinar. Will you explain that so I can respond to it? Because I'm not understanding your comment. So, all right. This is a great tip for your own stories. You can direct publishing of your book in your will. You're not entirely sure if someone's actually to publish it. So what I do is I have a whole section of books that I have published or printed. It's a different word. I printed, and it's like, hey, I don't want everybody in the family to know about this. This is my story. After I'm passed or after they's passed, you can share it. So you can print it, and then it's not shared with everybody until after you passed away. Let's see. I like that P. Smith. I keep saying Paul because I have a relative named Paul. So your P might not be Paul, but you're writing for the history for future generations, not today. Yeah. If you think about that, like, I'm trying to benefit the people of today so they can understand their past, so they can heal and overcome or build upon the legacy that is good. I think that's a great approach. How do I call an ancestor a scumbag for leaving his family? Ethically, I would just go, like I said, be specific. He left his family and this is what happened. And then let your reader say that's a scumbag move. So that's how I'd go about doing that. Let the reader say, that guy's a jerk. That guy's a scumbag. That's a deadbeat dad. You don't have to put the words in your reader's mouth of what to think about his actions. Just outline his actions and your readers will pick up on it. All right. I think I have all to it. Okay. So real quick, it was an earlier comment about family streak. Unethical for me to reveal that I was told that this children did not belong to their purported father. Again, it all depends. Where is this story? Is it taking place about living children? This, that, or the other? I do have some family members that through DNA testing, I accidentally found out their parents aren't who their parents are. In the family story, I already published that they are just the documented children of these people. In future editions, somebody's going to probably have to come and say, actually, at the age of, I'm not going to say, at the age of whatever, so-and-so found out that their biological father is this person and not that person, that explain some dynamics of the family, so on and so forth. But the person who is impacted by that misattributed parent, they need to sign off before that story is recorded for everybody to have. But in my own private library, I go ahead and write it down because it's a factual accuracy. You know, I put it in my family tree. I try not to put it on a public family tree. And that's how I handle those things. Okay, I think that's all I can handle for today. My daughter is going to be yelling and calling very soon. Let's continue this discussion in the comment section. I really want your feedback. Did you like this? Did you not like this? Is there something I left out? Is there something you really, really enjoyed? Keep the comments coming, and be sure to look for the poll that will be on the comments tab of Write Your Family History of what the next video topic will be. Until next time, write those stories. You can do it. Bye.